Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the show. Now this episode is all about a compliance failure. It just happens to have taken place in 1549. It's about a rebellion, power, and what happens when people in authority try to impose change without fully understanding or maybe caring how others will react. But to explain why I'm talking about a 16th century uprising on a podcast about human risk, I need to start with a train journey. Earlier this year, I was travelling from London to Exeter. For listeners unfamiliar with the UK, Exeter is a historic cathedral city and the county town of Devon in the southwest of England. I was on my way there to give a keynote to a client, and as I always do when I'm travelling to speak at an event, I was thinking about what stories I was going to tell to make my points more relevant. Because one of the things I care hugely about is making sure that what I talk about connects with the specific audience I'm speaking to. It's a presentation for that audience, in that venue, on that day, which means I'm always having to do research to try and find things that'll resonate. It's more work for me, but I think it's really important. And on that day, I'd chosen to take the slow train from Waterloo Station rather than the express train from Paddington Station. So I had a more relaxed and scenic journey. Partly because I had the time, but also because for me, it's about the journey as much as the destination. And on this occasion, that turned out to be particularly important. Because as I sat there somewhere between London and Exeter, I started looking for local flavour that I could bring into my talk. The venue I was heading to was right next to Sandy Park, home of the Exeter Chiefs rugby team, so I assumed I'd find a story about sport that would inspire the audience. But instead, in my research, I found something else entirely. I discovered that just a short distance from where I was going to be speaking, literally within eye line of the hotel the event was taking place in, there'd been a battle. A real one in 1549. And the more I looked into it, the more fascinating it became, because this wasn't just a minor skirmish, it was part of a major uprising, what's often referred to as the Prayer Book Rebellion, a reaction to a decision by the king at the time to impose a new set of rules about how people needed to worship. And at that point something clicked, because this wasn't just a story about religion, this was about compliance, about what happens when authority says, this is how things will be done now, and the people on the receiving end fundamentally disagree. So on that slow train journey, I had enough time to go down a rabbit hole. I discovered there was a book about the rebellion written by Professor Mark Stoyle, which I downloaded and started reading so I knew more about the story of the Battle of Clyst Heath. By the time I'd arrived in Exeter, I was completely hooked. In fact, the very first thing I did when I got off the train, before going to the hotel, was to walk straight into a local bookstore and buy a physical copy of Mark's book. Because although I'd got more than enough content for my speech, I wanted to understand this story properly. Now, what's particularly interesting to me is that this all took place in a part of the world I know reasonably well. I went to school not that far away from where these events took place. And yet, like many of the people in the audience the next day, I asked for a show of hands to see how many people had heard of the battle I was referring to. I had no idea about some of the details of what had happened, which in itself is intriguing. But what's more interesting to me is what the story reveals, because here's a central authority imposing change, people reacting emotionally, culturally, and ultimately violently, small incidents escalating into something much bigger, and a failure to anticipate or maybe care how humans respond when something they care deeply about is threatened. In other words, this is a story about human risk and how to manage it, or rather, how not to manage it. So having stumbled across this almost by accident on a train on the way to a talk, I thought I needed to speak to the person who understands this best. Very kindly, Professor Mark Stoyle agreed to join me. So this is a conversation with him about what he calls the Western Rising of 1549. But it's also about something much more contemporary. It's about power, belief, and how not to get people to follow rules. What you're about to hear is the story of what drove the rule changes and why people were so outraged by them that they stood up and rebelled. But you'll also get insights into why this was so historically significant, what lessons we can learn from it today, and how a historian goes about writing a balanced account of events when, as we know, history is so often written by the victors. So whether you're familiar with the West Country or you just like hearing stories from the past that resonate with what we see today, this is the episode for you. So please enjoy an episode on a subject that would never have occurred to me I'd ever feature on the show, but which is about as on theme as you can get. I think you're going to find this really interesting, all thanks to a serendipitous venue choice by one of my clients. It's my discussion with Professor Mark Stoyle on the Western Rising of 1549. Mark, welcome to the Human Risk Podcast.
Thank you, Christian. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's an absolute thrill to have you here because you've written a fabulous book that obviously we will come on and talk about. But before we get to that, could you tell my listeners a little bit about yourself and your area of research?
Yeah, well, I'm a Devonian. So I grew up here in Devon. And when I left school, I actually became an archaeologist. So my sort of first job was digging as a field archaeologist in Exeter. Really enjoyed it, getting to sort of grips with the history of the city through the sort of the physical environment, if you like. That led me into the archives, carrying out work on the history of Exeter over time. And gradually I sort of developed from there, went off to university to do history and archaeology originally, but then moved into more historical sort of side of things. So now I'm professor of history at University of Southampton. And my three sort of main research interests, which have all grown out of my sort of teenage interests, are really the history of Tudor rebellions, which is the main thing we're going to be talking about today, the history of the English Civil War, which I'm also really interested in, and finally the history of witchcraft. And all three of those things have a big link to my home city of Exeter.
Love this. So this is the young Mark trying to make sense of the environment in which he grew up in, just natural curiosity about the world around you?
It's really hard to say. I mean, I think I've always been kind of in love with the past. And because Exeter has such a rich and varied past, it was a legionary fortress. So the city walls of Exeter, which I'm really interested in, go back to Roman times. I think just growing up aware of all that history all around me, it just sort of sparked off a sort of enthusiasm, which has never left me. I've been incredibly lucky in that respect.
I love this because I think people that are able to pursue their passion in their jobs, I think that's where we all aspire to. So firstly, congratulations for making it happen.
Thank you.
And also congratulations for making it interesting for the rest of us, because it's really easy to be passionate about things oneself that doesn't necessarily spread. And you have there's a joy that clearly and passion for what you do that comes across both in the way that you talk, but also in your writing. So I want to say thank you for sort of role modeling what the younger version of me would have aspired to be, which was somebody that had a job that clearly suited them and interested. The way that I came across you, Mark, was a book that you published called The Western Rising of 1549, which for anybody who's confused, that's not a time, that's a date. Take us back to that period and tell us what was happening that led to a rising.
Well, this is a really sort of revolutionary time in English history. So, right throughout the medieval period, England had always been part of the Catholic Church. We were just part of the wider sort of Western Christendom. And then in the reign of Henry VIII, Henry came to the throne in 1509, suddenly he launched this kind of religious revolution because the Pope refused to allow him to divorce his loyal first wife, Catherine of Aragon. He sort of launched out on an attack on the church to try and pressure the Pope into agreeing to annul his first marriage, which would allow him to marry Anne Boleyn. So this is the kind of background. And as a result of that, Henry realized that the more he attacked the church, the more he realized how much he could kind of get out of them. So first of all, he sort of declared himself head of the Church of England, and then he dissolved the monasteries and seized their wealth. So that's already a massive change that happened during Henry's reign. Obviously, a lot of people were very upset about this. People were worried, where's the king leading us? But he sort of, towards the end of his life in the 1540s, Henry kind of stabilizes his position a bit. I think he probably realized he'd pushed people almost as far as they could go. And he ends up with this really strange position that he's created a kind of Catholicism without the Pope. So that was the situation when Henry died in 1547. He'd completely destabilized the country in religious terms. And he'd also taken huge sums of money out of the coffers of the public, and of course all the money he'd stolen from the church, and used that really in his own wars. So he left England divided in religious terms, not very well off. And worst of all, because of all his various matrimonial problems, the only male heir he left behind was a 9-year-old boy called Edward. And Edward comes to the throne in 1547. Obviously, with a child on the throne, that's extremely destabilizing as well. And when you add in all of these religious problems that were already there, that's all bad enough. But then to make matters even worse, almost as soon as Edward arrives on the throne, he and his government embark on a sort of a project of radical religious change, now moving not just from Catholicism without the Pope, but to full-on Protestantism. And all of those things together, a child on the throne, religious instability, religious revolution, huge amounts of poverty and resentment against taxation, they all come together to create a kind of perfect storm in 1548 to 9.
So many parallels to the modern world. We can think of authority figures where the rules don't suit them,
Yeah.
and therefore they try and change things. People taking advantage of being in positions of power to serve their own personal ends, disruptive strategies and policies. So we can already start to see, as we just talk in those loose terms, we don't even need to name names.
Yeah.
We can point to various regimes around the world
Yes.
where these dynamics still exist in the current day. And that what I thought was very, very interesting. You presumably see those I mean, clearly you're steeped in the detail of the past, and I wouldn't want to draw too many parallels, but the broad human dynamics are fairly similar.
Yes. And I think also just the thing that's really bored in on me throughout all of my years of study is really just how dangerous fanatical forms of religion can be. And I mean, I think that this is it. Before Henry arrived on the throne, the English were really united in religious terms, English, Welsh and Cornish, I should say, all in the same kingdom, but they were essentially united in the same faith. And once that unity is broken down and you have fanatical believers in this new religion and also people who are fervently sticking to the old religion, I think that creates a situation in which it's really difficult to compromise.
Because there's obviously no middle ground, right? And if we look at things like the language of the services, traditionally in Latin, moved over to English, there isn't really a sort of hybrid position between those two things.
Not really. I mean, I think in a way, Henry VIII had kind of managed to create a kind of stability at the end of his reign. He'd pushed people about as far as they would go, but he had managed to avoid successful rebellions against himself. But I think once they had pushed from this relatively bizarre form of Catholicism, which Henry had established, into an actual clash between Catholicism on the one hand and Protestantism on the other, that's where compromise, I think, becomes very difficult.
And so we've got this incredibly young monarch. And clearly, when we talk in those terms, theoretically, they're the ones making the decisions, but we know how that works in reality. There will be people there seeking to influence. Tell us a little bit about what's driving the process for him to go even further than his father did.
Well, this is really interesting that Edward is a child, but obviously, in a way, he's rather unusual. He's a royal child. He's been very, very much sort of schooled in an incredible hothouse atmosphere. It was said that when he was younger still, about 6 or 7, his best friend was the professor of Greek at Cambridge University, which shows you the kind of, that's the kind of atmosphere he'd grown up in. So he's a very clever child, and he's also fanatically Protestant. He had been put in the care of Protestant tutors, very unwise of Henry VIII. And Edward clearly believes, that this is the right faith, Catholicism is the wrong faith. And this means that although he's not fully in control, the one thing that, he's absolutely determined on is that England is moving towards Protestantism. So even the adults around him who are really, his uncle, the Duke of Somerset, Edward Seymour, he's actually the protector. So if you like, he's the quasi-king. And a lot of what Somerset does, it's obviously his own volition. But on religion, he doesn't really have the option of moving back towards Catholicism, because that's the one thing that Edward would not brook.
So what is it that starts this rising in the West? What are the incidents that drive to that?
Well, again, it's been a long time coming, if you like, that Henry first breaks with the church in Rome, breaks away from the Pope, begins to attack the authority of the church, dissolves the monasteries. All of that's created huge sort of change in the religious life, which most people have grown up with and were accustomed to. And then with Edward, they go further still, and they're now moving from what you could just about see as a twisted version of Catholicism into something that's a completely different brand of Christianity. And many people believe it's heretical and utterly wrong, and that their immortal souls are in peril because of what the government is doing.
This is based on, I guess, they've grown up with a particular set of beliefs. They've gone to church for those beliefs, and suddenly someone is upsetting it. And as you say, not in a minor way, but there are these fundamental shifts. And so they've had enough, I guess.
Exactly. I mean, this is it. I think a lot of areas of the country were, particularly the North, Wales, Devon and Cornwall, very, very conservative, traditional Catholic areas. They'd already been pushed about as far as they could go under Henry VIII. And I think, obviously, Henry VIII, we haven't got time to discuss him, but he was a pretty terrifying character. And I think that his authority and his legitimacy mean that even though people are very unhappy about who it's doing, they sort of go along with it. But of course, with Edward on the throne, that regime just doesn't have the same degree of legitimacy, because most people in the country think the king has no idea what's going on. He's being told what to do. The orders that are coming down from London are not really coming from the king. They're from an evil cabal of men around him.
With, again, parallels to the 21st century.
Indeed.
In many respects. And so what struck me is in your account is that it seems to be relatively small incidents
Yeah.
that then sort of flare up. And I guess there are lots of incidents that we wouldn't know about because they weren't recorded.
Yes.
I'd love to come on and talk about the sources that you use for this research. But for now, as we look at it, there are some very small things that happen that suddenly become very, very large very quickly. There's I guess there's a virality to this.
Yes. I mean, there are all sorts of things going on at once. So at the same time as unleashing this religious revolution, Protector Somerset, who's, as I say, de facto ruler, is also carrying on a war against the Scots, which again is very expensive. You know, the early modern English state is a second-rank power in European terms. It's not terribly efficient. You know, its sort of financial systems. War puts a huge pressure on the system. And one of the other things that's interesting is the way that religious and economic issues become intertwined. So to give you an example of that, Somerset's regime actually dissolves the chantries, which are the sort of religious institutions where prayers were said for the dead. So they get rid of the chantries and they take their land and they use that money for the war. But again, if you can imagine from the point of view of sort of pious Catholics, those chantries had been established over years to say prayers for one's dead ancestors who are in purgatory, sort of trapped there until they can get to heaven. So by dissolving the chantries, essentially for financial and religious reasons, the government is sort of saying to all sorts of traditional Catholics, we don't care about your past ancestors in purgatory. You know, they can rot there for all we care. It means nothing to us. And so people feel, well, you know, my granddad, my grandmother may be trapped in purgatory eternally because they've got rid of the prayers that were being said for their souls.
And I guess by implication, I may end up there myself one day.
Exactly.
Right? And therefore we need to keep this thing going. Otherwise, there's a major problem. So if you were looking at which buttons to press, this is a particularly kind of like we do it right at the end.
Yeah.
It's a particularly vulnerable point. And I love the framing there where you say yes for religious reasons, but actually, here's a way to make some money. Right? We start. So it's not only sort of coming from a different point, but it's very, very disrespectful in terms of the angle in it. So one can start to see, and this is why I think the narrative of this is fascinating. You can start to see why people were, the sort of the phrase pissed off wouldn't get there. I mean, there was people furious and confused and all those sorts of emotions.
And desperate, really, because I think another thing is that, you know, again, it's hard to overstate how destabilizing the dissolution of the monasteries was, because these were huge religious institutions with massive land holdings. They had been a part of the patchwork of English life for 300, 400 years. Suddenly, those are taken out. Then at the beginning of Edward's reign, the chantries, which again are smaller but still very important religious institutions, are taken out. And at the same time, the government is sending out people to make lists of all of the treasures which are held in the parish churches. And many people believe that parish churches will be next, and that Edward's government is going to continue what Henry's government began and essentially completely strip out all of the religious infrastructure which had existed for centuries before.
And so there are these instances of people just going, we're not going to have this, right? And so when there's a requirement to do services in English, some people have had enough, right? And therefore take action.
And again, just to stress how significant that was, Henry had not made those changes. You know, he had certainly attacked the monasteries and he'd put himself in charge of the church, but he had not sort of tinkered with the Catholic Mass. And that was the central part of the liturgy. You know, the Catholic liturgy, rather, is the central part of the service. And that's, if you like, you know, where ordinary people go to church every week. They would go to hear the Mass. If you attack that, you're sort of striking at the very heart of their religious experience. And the other crucial thing to stress is that they saw Latin as a holy tongue. They didn't understand it. Most people didn't understand it. But nevertheless, it was almost like God's tongue. And to attack it and replace it with English is to kind of debase it in many ways and make it less spiritual and less special.
Which is fascinating because logic, and I recognize humans aren't always logical, would sort of have you, we'll take something that you don't understand and translate it into something. Now, we might be suspicious about the translation, but nonetheless, it would, in theory, it ought to be more user-friendly for it to be in English. But the point that you're making is that they are used to it being, and therefore, actually, the lack of understanding, which one could argue is a feature of the religion. It doesn't need to be comprehensible by people because we're going to
Indeed.
translate it for them. So
Yeah.
that's a sort of, you could argue, a sort of controlling feature of it, even though you could say it ought to be in their interest to understand what's going on. They're not
Yeah.
having any of that.
And I mean, if I could draw sort of a modern parallel, over the last sort of 40, 50 years, there have been lots of new prayer books brought in the Church of England. They've been brought in designed to make what's said in the services more easily comprehensible to today's audience, which I can see is kind of a laudable aim in some ways. But lots of people who grew up with the traditional prayer book service absolutely loathe these changes. And that's when it's just a change from old-fashioned English into more modern English. So if you can imagine how much greater that resentment would have been if you'd moved from what was seen as a holy language to this very sort of dubious form of modern English, they simply don't see it as having the same validity. And the other point to make is that under the old Catholic dispensation, most people had never understood the service. It was just seen as a holy rite. You'd go along to listen, you'd catch the cadences of what was being said, you'd enjoy the sort of the beauty of holiness in the church and watching the priest go about his rituals and his devotions. So it's a frontal assault on that whole way of being and that whole sort of religiosity. The other point to bear in mind is that if the replacement of Latin with English upsets people in England, you can imagine how much it upsets people in those parts of Cornwall where they were still speaking Cornish. So for them, what they have lost is the old holy tongue, and what's replacing it is not a service in Cornish, but they're now being forced to listen to English. So it's a kind of cultural imposition as well as a religious one. And it's actually in Cornwall, I think, that the first really big resistance to this appears. I mean, I won't go into enormous detail about this, but the government kind of trials, before the new Book of Common Prayer is brought out in 1549, they trial a certain part of the service, which is just the order of communion. A little bit of it is trialed in English. And it's very interesting that just literally 2 or 3 days after that has been ordered to be done, there is a kind of mini rebellion in West Cornwall, which is the most Cornish-speaking district of that county. And I do think that, this first appearance of English in the Mass, that instantly infuriated the Cornish and led to a small rebellion. And then the following year, when the full prayer book in English is rolled out, there's this huge rebellion.
And interesting that you talk about it as a trial. It's sort of, it almost feels like, do you see that as, is this sort of a little bit of, we'll put something out there to see how it goes? Because clearly the intention is to move to the full English version.
Yes.
So is that to sort of allow a bit of anger to seep out at that point and we'll deal with it there? Why are they experimenting on that basis? Because I would have thought the way you described it, you might as well just go for it because it's not going to go down well in certain quarters.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. I presume it is a kind of dipping of the toe into the water to see what
That's a much better way to put it, right? Yeah.
But I mean, it might be simply that, they had managed to get round to doing the translation of this communion service, but the order of communion first. And obviously doing the whole prayer book is a big job.
A lot of work, right?
So it takes a while. So it might be, well, look, let's start with this and we'll move on to that when we've got it all done. That's something I'd have to go back and check on. I don't know exactly why they do it that way, but my guess is it's a mixture of caution and simply just that's the way we're going to have to do it because we haven't got time to do it all at once.
So it gets rolled out, and then you talk about a particular incident where priest is told under no uncertain terms that he's not to go ahead with the new English version, and it's to stick to the traditional script.
Yes. And I mean, I could imagine that happening in Anglican churches today when some of the new prayer books are sort of rolled out, that people are so angry. If they could have persuaded their clergymen to stick with the old version, they would. You're probably aware, Christian, that in lots of Anglican churches today, there are services still held using, the old service book because so many of the elderly parishioners don't like the new one. So that's quite a nice compromise. You kind of use both, but obviously the government was not going to agree to that. So I think there would have been a lot of places where there'd have been huge resentment. But here in Sanford Courtney, which is the village where it all begins, not only are the people very resentful, not only they dare to tell the vicar they're not going to accept it, but he actually agrees to do what they suggest. So he goes back, he puts on the old Catholic vestments, which had been banned, and he reads the Mass again as in times accustomed. And that's a sign that, the local authority figure has kind of buckled to pressure, which obviously then encourages people roundabout still further.
And so how does this then grow from this one, I guess just one single service is all that it takes really for word to get out?
That's it. So initially this happens at Sanford Courtney and instantly word gets around to the local parishes. So I don't know if you've been to Sapford Courtney itself, but it's this tiny parish. Well, it's a tiny village just to the north of Dartmoor. It's very remote. Even now, it's quite remote. A beautiful village. If any of your listeners want to visit it, lovely place to visit. It's still very unspoiled. And so initially, it's those sort of surrounding parishes, and a group of local gentlemen at that point ride in to confront the people who've gathered in Sapford Courtney churchyard. And I think at this point, we should probably just imagine them as being a few hundred people. There's a sort of a negotiation between the gentlemen and the farmers, really, who'd led the protesters. And at this point, the gentry are not able to force these guys to simply go home. And the gentry turn tail and leave the village. And according to the main local chronicler of these events, who's seeing it very much from the Protestant point of view, he says it was what he calls the cowardice of the gentry in not forcing these local people to do what they wanted. That's what lets the whole thing kind of blow up from there, because as soon as the local gentry, the justices of the peace, have shown that they're not prepared to sort of deal harshly with this, more and more people come in to join the demonstrators.
And obviously the government doesn't want to allow that to continue. And so we start to see, not attempts to suppress it, they begin to move to suppress this and shut this down.
Yeah, I mean, the government is facing a lot of problems at this time because 1549 is a fascinating year. It is the most rebellious year in the whole Tudor period. There are small rebellions taking place all over England. And in the area around London, there's actually a huge demonstration against various sort of economic factors that are really troubling people in that region. So the government is kind of firefighting and dealing with all sorts of local...
There's a cost of living crisis, I guess, for want of a better phrase.
In a way, yes. At the same time, it's this crisis of conscience in terms of religion. And I think that initially the government hopes that this can be put down relatively easily. They send orders to their local supporters amongst the gentry to kind of put an end to this. And this is where things really begin to go wrong, because the protesters who gathered at Sapford Courtney, their numbers are now swelling, and they make their way to Crediton, which is a market town halfway between Sapford Courtney, where the rebellion began, and Exeter, which is the main regional capital, obviously. And it's while the demonstrators are gathered in Crediton, which incidentally is where I went to secondary school, the gentry ride out, attempt to have another negotiation with them, and then when the common people, the protesters, won't budge, they actually launch an attack on them. And as a result of that, a number of the demonstrators are killed, a number of barns and possibly houses are burnt down by the gentlemen. And suddenly, after that, this first blood leads to terrifying rumours spreading all over the countryside. People begin to say, well, look, our friends have been attacked. The gentlemen are attacking, these Protestant gentlemen are attacking, our Catholic neighbours. And at that point, huge numbers of people begin to come in to join the rebels. So the government's local supporters are now completely outnumbered.
And I presume there's obviously the communication channels is word of mouth. So
yes.
we're not looking at, if we thought about it nowadays, obviously that we all have our own individual channels of communication. Back in those days, rumors can spread very, very quickly. So this is classic viral behavior in terms of stories. And if you add the emotion into this, you can sort of see how this becomes a very serious battle for your, I guess, both there's a fear that you might no longer be around to live. There's a fear about what the future holds.
Yeah.
So this has become quite visceral, I guess.
Yes, I think this is it. We see this, as you say, very much in our own day. There are protests, there are angry protests. People can get very sort of worked up about all sorts of issues, but it's usually only when people are actually hurt and people are killed that then the real sort of outrage grows. And people perhaps who were not initially so worried begin to sort of come in on one side or the other. So I think it's that first blood at Crediton that turns this from what could still have been a peaceful protest that could have been negotiated away into an actual armed rebellion. So I would say that's a crucial tipping point.
And I want to come on and talk about some of the sources and what you've learned from it. So just to sort of finish the story, obviously this cannot be led to stand. So we then lead into a series of further battles and the thing is basically quashed.
Yes, I mean, it's a long drawn out process. What happens first is that essentially the whole of Devon virtually is now up in arms, and they march the leaders of the rebels with their supporters to the outskirts of Exeter. And so Exeter at that time was very important. It's one of the 5 or 6 biggest cities in the kingdom. And most people in Exeter were actually quite sympathetic towards the rebels. And I think they were very hopeful that Exeter would come over to them, but in fact it doesn't. And this is partly because the rulers of the city just, you know, they're rich and wealthy men. They're well in with the government. They think, well, what will happen if we go against the government? What could happen to us? So they decide to resist. And there is a small hardcore of Protestants in Exeter who are determined to resist these Catholic heretics. So as a result of that, the Devon protesters begin a siege of Exeter, which is unfortunate from their point of view, because obviously if they wanted to actually do something at the centre, they needed to get to London and do something to the government. But at this point, there's a huge explosion of anger in Cornwall as well. The Cornish hear what's happening in Devon. They raise a large army, perhaps 6,000 rebels, Cornish rebels, that marches to Exeter, joins the rebels besieging Exeter, and then, really significantly, I think, begins to advance beyond Exeter in the direction of London. Now, at that point, the government's army, which has been sent down, it's too small to actually attack the rebels. It doesn't dare to attack them because the rebels have got something like 10,000 men by this time. And at this point, the Cornish advance guard has a small battle with the leader of the royal forces in East Devon, and the Cornish are sort of worsted and pushed back. And literally a day or two after that, forces of foreign mercenaries that have been sent down from London join the leader of the royal army. And from that point onwards, the advantage is very much with the king's forces. But I think if the Cornish had got there a day or two before in strength, they could easily have defeated this very small government army, which doesn't have any sort of professional soldiers with it. The whole story of the rebellion could have been different. So it's a close run thing, to be honest.
I love this. The way you talk about it, the enthusiasm you have for the story and the interest comes streaming across. So as you're looking at this topic, and thank you for that, there's a heck of a lot more detail in the book, a heck of a lot more detail that goes into research, but how are you researching this? Because it always struck me that, there's the classic phrase about that winners get to write history.
Exactly.
And yet you appear to have quite a lot of insights from the side of the rebels. And that's not something I would naturally have expected, given the sort of the cliche around where one gets information from. What are the sort of key sources that you're using, and how are you able to get that side of things?
I mean, you're absolutely right, Christian. It's always the victors who write the history, and this is no exception. I mean, what I've tried to do, and I'm really delighted that you said that, is to try and look at it from both sides. But I mean, I don't think I confessed to you before when you were chatting, but this book has taken me years to write. I have been working on it probably for a quarter of a century. And one of the points is to try and look at things from the rebel point of view, because there is only one coherent contemporary account of the Western Rebellion, and that is written by a man called John Hooker, who is a Protestant who lived in the city of Exeter, and he wrote a very good eyewitness history of this rebellion, but it's all very much from his side. It's very pro-Protestant, it's pro-government, it's castigating the rebels as sort of lunatics. He actually literally calls them lunatics at one point. Misled, papists, people he's very, very dismissive of. And so that has led for most of the histories that have been written ever since to be very much written from the government's point of view. And although, lots of historians have tried to see through this bias, there has been this feeling, well, the Western rebels were sort of deluded fools, they were ignorant peasants, they were fighting the future, they were bound to fail, all these sorts of things. Whereas I think, if you look at it, what I've tried to do is to find as many different sources as I can that don't come from Hooker, to try and complement what he's doing and to flesh out the story and try and see things a bit more from his opponent's point of view. So that was really the whole point of my book, to certainly to use and value Hooker. He's a great source, but to try and, how can I put it, allow for the fact that he is constantly telling the story from one side and there is another side to it as well.
And how are literacy levels at that time? I guess there were presumably limitations there in given people's level of education. You're going to have restricted sources.
Absolutely. And this is the problem that, as you say, victors write the history. If you imagine, I'm sure that you'll have seen from the book, there are terrible repercussions. So eventually, after the government has sent down these forces of foreign mercenaries, Burgundians, Italians, Albanians, they unleash this force on the West Country, the Devon and Cornish sort of peasants in effect, and thousands of them are killed. Literally 4,000 people are thought to have been killed in this rising, which is massive for two relatively small counties. So there was also a huge there was martial law was declared across the two counties after the rebellion was over. Lots of people were hanged, lots of people were beaten up, fined, all the sort of reign of terror, really. And you can imagine that anybody who had anything to do with the rebellion afterwards would absolutely deny involvement. And the most important thing was to destroy any document or anything that showed that proof that you've been involved in it. So we have virtually nothing at all that survives in terms of the rebels' own writing, apart from the demands they sent up to the government. And that's almost all we have in terms of their point of view.
Yeah, you hinted at it before, but the Cornish language was obviously a major victim of this in the sense that, and I guess I hadn't really fully appreciated that it had died out in the way that it died out. I'm aware that the language exists. I presumed that there were some people that kept it going. But actually, having read the story and to research around it more, I mean, this seems to be really this was the reason the language died out.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the death knell for Cornish, really. There's no doubt the language had been gradually becoming weaker over time. So it gradually retreated towards the west. At the beginning of the medieval period, I'd say the great majority of people still spoke Cornish. But by the Tudor period, it's more like a Cornish-speaking west and a more English-speaking east. But you can imagine that these religious changes have a huge effect because everyone had to go to church every week. And in the western half of Cornwall, before the Reformation, they were going to hear their church service in Latin. And then they might have, sermons and the Lord's Prayer and things in Cornish. After the Reformation, or after Edward's Reformation, suddenly that all changes. English is being brought in to those West Cornish parishes and kind of enforced on the people there from that time onwards. So that was obviously going to have a really bad effect on the survival of the language anyway. But I think, ironically, the rebellion makes things worse because the Cornish actually complain specifically about this English prayer book and say, we Cornishmen want nothing to do with it. And the government even believed, although we can't be sure that this is true, that the Cornish had asked for their own prayer book in Cornish rather. And of course, the trouble with this is that the Cornish language then becomes kind of stained with the taint of rebelliousness. And there was no way that the government was going to give these terrible rebels what they'd asked for. And so the result of this, I think, is that you've got the imposition of the English prayer book and Bible on the Cornish. You've got killing of large numbers of Cornish people during the rebellion. And then you've got this sort of connection in the government's mind between Cornishness and rebelliousness. So they never get a prayer book in their own language and they never get a Bible in Cornish. And if you compare that with what happened in Wales, where there was no rebellion and where instead they politely asked Queen Elizabeth if they could have a prayer book and a Bible in Welsh, which they were then given, I think that's the main reason why Welsh is still alive and healthy today and Cornish has completely disappeared.
Wow. And as you were talking, my mind sort of goes to parallels. And I think that language, and if we think about Basque language in I was about to say in Spain, but in that part of the world, because obviously it doesn't just cover Spain.
Yes.
This is really a fascinating example of history repeating itself.
Mm.
And I wondered, as a historian, it must be fascinating for you because you're obviously looking at what's happened and you're making sense of it. And you've talked about your own personal background there. But I guess your mind must wander to the simple. It strikes me we haven't learned many of the lessons from the past.
No, I mean, I think it's difficult because I think with languages, one of the tragedies of today is that loads of the languages in the world now are dying out. And, there are lots now with just 2 or 3 speakers left, which is really tragic. And that seems to be a consequence of globalization more than anything else. And these things were already taking off in the early modern period. And Cornish is partly just a casualty of that. I think probably it would have died out sooner or later. But this absolutely hastens it and kind of nails down the coffin on it. But I mean, I do find it tragic. And you were talking earlier about how hard it is to get at the voices, the rebels themselves, the ordinary men and women of Tudor England who couldn't read and write. That's absolutely true, Christian. But what I think, again, is sad is that those Cornish speakers, ordinary Cornish people in the west of Cornwall, their history is almost completely lost to us because there is virtually nothing left of it. So that's like a complete kind of cultural loss as well.
So it's almost echoes of colonization, where there is a culture there. It is subsumed into that larger culture, sort of driven out. So I think again, I've tended to sort of thought of the Great Britain as a colonizer, but actually, if we look at it here, this is happening on the island.
Yeah, I mean, lots of people say that Cornwall is England's first colony. And I mean, having said that, I don't want to use really pejorative language. I mean, I think there were very few people in England who actually wanted to get rid of Cornish. Some sort of more extreme Cornish nationalists might say, this is a deliberate plan to get rid of Cornishness. I don't think it's that at all. I just think it's like they don't really care. They're not that bothered about Cornishness. They want to impose what they want to impose. And if Cornishness happens to be, a casualty of that, well, it's not really, they're just not that bothered. There's no actual intention of driving out the Cornish culture, the Cornish tongue, but that is a byproduct of other things, I think, that are set in train during this period.
You talked a little bit about the unexpected outcomes and the fact that the rebellion, ironically, had downsides for the rebels, not in terms of where it took the language. As we looked at it, I'm always fascinated by sort of people's ability to plan ahead, because this is obviously human dynamics here. So things can evolve quite naturally. How much thinking, based on what you've seen, was given to sort of future outcomes, or were people acting on gut instinct? Because it strikes me that if one were approaching it from a sort of government perspective in the 21st century, you'd be alive to how this might land. You'd be thinking, I hesitate to say you'd sort of be thinking a spin around it, but you'd be thinking much more around those predictive dynamics. I guess back in that day, people were acting much more on gut instinct, and therefore, and particularly, I suppose, with the anger that was behind it.
I'm not sure. I would say that both sides did have an outcome that they were seeing. I think the government's point of view is quite simple. It's really under siege in 1549. There is trouble everywhere. I think the people running the government are really frightened. And Somerset in particular is fearful that he will be toppled and someone else will be put in as Edward's sort of protector. So, he will lose power. Another sort of regent figure will come in. So he's determined to see these rebels put down if they cannot be negotiated with. And obviously, as we've said already, there is no room really for negotiation between diehard Catholics and radical Protestants. So if these people cannot be negotiated down, he is determined to see them utterly crushed. So from his point of view, it's almost, if my regime is going to survive, I have to take out these people. So he has quite a clear game plan, I think. Negotiate if possible, negotiate with them, send them home, promise them almost anything as long as you can get them to go home. But if they won't, crush them.
And is there a parallel universe in which that could have been successful, or are the emotions and the religious connection here too strong?
Well, this is the interesting thing about 1549. As I said, there are a lot of rebellions taking place all over the south of England this time. And Somerset does manage to negotiate quite a lot of them down because they're really about economic issues or tax, those sorts of things. So he can kind of make concessions or say, don't worry, we'll deal with it. And in those ways, he's quite successful. So quite a lot of these other risings are put down peacefully. But of course, with the Western rebels and the group in Oxfordshire that arose at the same time, they're determined not to accept the Protestant Reformation. He cannot really negotiate with them. Really, it is a question of one side or the other is going to win. So because they refuse to negotiate with him, and their religious principles, if you like, are non-negotiable, and so are his, there is no way really but to put them down. But jumping back to what you said about what's the sort of the long-term goal? A lot of previous historians have argued that the Western rebels were just acting on gut instinct. They've got no real plan. They were bound to be defeated. They were trying to hold back the future and all these things. One of the things that I've really felt while I'm writing this book is that they had a clear plan as well, and that this actually involved Edward's older sister. And this is where Queen Mary, or Queen Mary as she was to become, comes into the picture. So Henry VIII had left behind 3 children. He's got his 9-year-old son, Edward, who actually gets the throne. He's got his teenage daughter, Elizabeth, and he also has his adult daughter, Mary. Now, Mary was herself an absolutely fervent Catholic. She was very popular in England. She was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife. And Catherine had known for years that she and Henry only had a daughter. And so, she was actually getting Mary ready to be a queen. She was trained to be a queen. And large numbers of people in England, I think, felt that, Mary would have been a much better regent than Somerset. And one of the things that I found intriguing going through this book is that there are sort of hints of links between some of the gentry in the Southwest who supported the Western Rebellion and Queen Mary. And the final point I'd make on this is the very day that the prayer book came out, that we've seen created this popular opposition in Devon, Queen Mary, she was like under house arrest in Norfolk at this time. And in her private chapel, she too refuses to accept the new prayer book and has a full-blown Catholic mass in her chapel. My feeling is that the West Country rebels did have a final end in view, and their view, their end was actually to get rid of Somerset, put Mary in as regent, and for her to govern until Edward came of age. And that would have completely transformed the course of English history.
Speaking of English history, I went to school in Somerset, and I
Yeah.
was trying to reflect back on what I was taught about this at school. Now, this was some time ago, so forgive me,
Same
my
here.
memory's not fresh. But I wondered, as a historian, is there a way that this has been taught that is potentially misleading? Because it strikes me that this is the sort of story that you would want, back to the victors writing history, you'd want it to be taught, but in a way that was a valuable lesson. Don't rebel against the crown. And as I combine it with other bits of my education, with hymns that were written in a particular way to deference to the crown, thinking of all things bright and beautiful, for example, has the narrative around this been very, very heavily driven towards here's a warning that one shouldn't rebel against the crown? Is that the way it's because I'm looking back very much through there's sort of wishful thinking, and that I want that to be the case because then I can sort of question my teachers. But was this framed in a particular way and used as propaganda, I guess, in schools?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, and I think both you and I will have had exactly the same experience, that although growing up after the Second World War, I think we're still very much, most of our teachers and most of the books we read were still in that very much sort of Protestant triumphalist strain. So, this idea of history as progress, England as a Protestant country, heading for the empire, and eventually Protestantism and, the House of Commons and democracy, we spread that to the whole world. It's this really triumphant view. And of course, the villains in that will always be the Catholics who tried to stop England becoming Protestant.
Right.
So, the Western rebels have been doubly damned by being rebels against the crown and being Catholic rebels against the crown. So, they have been usually taught as wrong and foolish and misguided and bound to fail. But I think that's very much a sort of a Protestant Whiggish view of what really happened.
And is that something implicitly that you'd like to see changed? I mean, obviously, you'd love it if every kid studied this in as much detail as you have. And I think you're the kind of history teacher that I think a lot of kids would love to have, because I've always taken the view that if you are a teacher of history and you can't make it interesting, you are not a very good teacher, right? Because the subject matter is there. And so it just strikes me that this sort of thing's really important, and yet probably wasn't given. It was covered, but it certainly wasn't given enough prominence, and particularly in the way you describe it. Now, some of that will have been, we didn't have the benefit of your research. As you say, we're moving on to more modern things. But part of me thinks it would be quite healthy to dive into some of these things a bit more, because it does back to the one, there's lessons for today. But secondly, I think it's a much more healthy narrative that as we look at some of the challenges in the 21st century, this still has resonances and consequences today.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, I think, it is very much that you don't want to look at history just from one perspective. It's really good to try and see the point of view of the victors and the vanquished. I think that's one of the really important things. And sometimes when I go out to give talks about this, people suspiciously say to me, "Are you a Catholic yourself? Is this like Catholic history?"
But that's a rebel propagandist, right?
No, I mean, I absolutely grew up in the Protestant tradition. And, it's not really that I'm not trying to push this from a kind of a partisan religious perspective, but more from the idea that you can applaud the bravery of Hooker and his friends who defended Exeter against this rebel army. But in some ways, I think what is more impressive is the fact that these quite relatively, most of the people who led the Western Rebellion initially, they were sort of relatively well-off farmers. They weren't really poor, but equally they weren't gentlemen or really rich. And I think it is pretty incredible that a group of people from that level of society actually managed to mount a really credible challenge to the crown in defense of their faith. And, whether you approve of their faith or not, I think it's an incredible effort that they made, and quite heroic, really.
As you're looking at this, are you still discovering, because I presume your work is not done with this story. There's more things you could look at. Are you building a narrative that's consistent, or are you still surprised by things that you come across?
Oh, I'm always surprised by new things I come across, Christian, but you're absolutely right. What I'm working on at the moment is the memory of the Western Rebellion and how this, I said, I think in the blurb to my book, this is the most traumatic thing that happened in the West Country between the Black Death and the Civil War. It's a huge number of casualties. It is like a mini civil war in Devon, Cornwall and Somerset. And everyone who lived through it was kind of traumatized by it. So just like our grandparents never forgot World War II and just called it the war, everyone down here just referred to this event as the commotion and the commotion time. And they remembered it from the rest of their lives. And lots of elderly men and women would kind of date things that happened in their lives from the commotion time. So it's a really interesting point that no one can forget it. But what I find intriguing is the only place that is able to celebrate what happened in 1549 is the city of Exeter, because it defended itself against the rebels. Once Queen Elizabeth comes in, obviously a stoutly Protestant monarch, Exeter has this incredible thing to boast about. We were the city that stood up for the Protestant faith and for your brother, and we're this incredibly loyal city, and we should be given all these things. So Exeter has milked the memory of the Western Rebellion for like 4.5 centuries, whereas all of the rest of Devon and Cornwall has had to stay very quiet about it. They were the rebels. They've not been allowed to boast about what they did. It's almost been pushed to the side by later generations who are actually quite embarrassed by it. So I think the fact there are these different kind of strands of memory, and that Exeter's civic identity is still really built on this idea of the ever loyal city, that goes back to 1549. I think that's fascinating as well.
I'm intrigued by the word commotion, because I can't work out if it's a euphemism or not. But
It is a
sort of,
euphemism.
I mean, I guess it would be, right? But it's a sort of interesting choice of words that sort of says something happened, but we don't want to talk about it, or?
Exactly. It's like the Troubles in Northern Ireland, because what do you call the Western Rebellion? We've always called it the Western Rebellion because that's what the government called it. This is the Western Rebellion, the Devon Rebellion, the Cornish Rebellion, always in a very, very negative way. Whereas if you use the term commotion, you're not suggesting you support it, but you're not suggesting you oppose it either. So it's a much more, it just makes the sort of day-to-day life easier for people in the West Country. They can talk about the commotion without kind of taking sides. But those who are fervently loyal always refer to it as the rebellion.
And talk to me about the word rising that you've used in your title.
Well, see, again, I wanted to use a title that was kind of less partisan. And I'm sure that you know, Christian, that for years, scholars have referred to this as the Prayer Book Rebellion. And I've taught this subject in university for a long, long time. And students used to write, I'd say, what were the causes of the Western Rise or the Western Rebellion? And students would write, well, it's called the Prayer Book Rebellion, so obviously it was about the prayer book. But
that's guaranteed to get me a high grade, right? It's like, I've nailed this.
While I was doing my research, I suddenly realized that term is a modern invention, that I couldn't find that term, Prayer Book Rebellion, being used before the First World War. So it's kind of a modern invention. So I thought, well, I don't really want to use that, but I don't really want to use rebellion because it's kind of sounding as if I'm coming at it from a government perspective. So I tried to use rising as a more neutral term that both sides could probably have lived with.
The original title of the book was A Murderous Midsummer.
Yes.
I'm intrigued by it's obviously the imposition of the new prayer book that's caused the problem, but presumably the time of year is also very significant here.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. This is the famous sort of time of the year when popular risings and disturbances often occurred. And it's because obviously we're moving into a time of the year where there were lots of popular festivities. It was a time when the sort of the rhythm of the agricultural year gave time for people to kind of enjoy themselves. And this actually takes place, the rebellion in Southwark-Courtenay begins very soon after Whit Sunday. And that was a sort of a famous time for popular festivity and sort of meetings up and drinkings and communal celebrations. The government always got very nervous at this time of the year. And they were afraid that plays, May games, other gatherings of people might lead to some sort of bigger communal stir. And that's what seems to have happened in 1549, although we cannot actually tie what happened at Southwark-Courtenay down to any other festive event. So there may have been something like that going on when the vicar was accosted, but if there was, we don't know.
Absolutely fascinating. Mark, very conscious of time.
Yeah.
So what's the thing that's really surprised you as you've looked at this and continue to study it?
I mean, I think probably just how serious it was, because like you, I went to school in the West Country and I had fantastic teachers. I loved my A-level history teacher, but we didn't actually look very much at local history.
Which is weird, right? Because which is actually brings me to the story of how I came across your book, because I was looking for something that would tie us to the locale.
Yeah.
And so it sort of almost struck me that that's a really, really good point, is you would kind of think it'd be helpful to know what happened in the local environs as one is sitting in the classroom. And so I think that feels really odd.
We just didn't do that at all. I mean, I really liked my history teaching at school, and we did some fantastic stuff on sort of 19th century history, but it was not really to do with Devon at all. I mean, I can't resist asking, whereabouts in Somerset did you go?
In Taunton.
In Taunton.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if you know, but the Western Rebellion spread out into Somerset. And there were some really bloody events at the end of 1549 Rising in West Somerset. And I mean, I'm sure when you were growing up, you heard of the bloody assizes and Judge
Yes.
Siegfried.
Yeah.
That was well known. But actually, I think what happened in the wake of the Western Rising in Somerset was probably even worse. And we know that loads of people were executed. They were hanged, drawn and quartered. Bits of their bodies were sort of fried in pans and covered with tar and set up at the entrances to villages. So, really atrocious things happen in Devon and Cornwall. And you and I were never really, and Somerset, you and I were never really taught about them.
Yeah, no, it was never clear to me whether it was either because we were focused on the exams and we need to get through this stuff and we need you to memorize the sort of, dates of kings and queens of England, those examinable facts.
Yeah.
Or if it was, back to my earlier thesis of don't get any ideas. But I would have thought, actually, some of the things you've talked about, like if you wanted to get people's interest in history, then actually, yes, they might be a little bit gruesome for young kids, but they happened.
Oh,
and this just strikes me, and this is why I love the book, because it was a sort of poster child for this is why going back and reading this stuff is interesting. Like we can learn lots of things, and the human dynamics that we may be slightly less brutal, although again, certain parts of the world we see some horrific things happening. But those basic dynamics of people fighting each other for power and decisions being made based less around fact and more around emotion, all of these things we can see them in the modern world.
Oh, definitely. I mean, and again, I sort of come back to this in the end that there would have been room for compromise on a lot of these things. But once you have two really intransigent forms of religion, or to be honest, even one where, the proponents simply will not tolerate any compromise, that is very scary. And I think this is what brought England to the very brink of civil war in 1549. And it brought England to civil war completely during the 1640s, essentially fighting over religion. And, very intolerant strains of religion are really quite scary and frightening. I think one of the great skills of the English after 1660 was they kind of realized that, these extremes of religion are dangerous. They set up this kind of slightly more middle of the road Church of England and actually allowed those who couldn't tolerate it to separate as nonconformists and dissenters. And I think that sort of tradition of tolerance, religious tolerance, is one of the most important things in English public life over the last sort of 200 years.
Well, as you were talking, my brain immediately went to politics and Brexit and division and all the things that we're seeing nowadays. And actually that idea of maintaining a centre and allowing not allowing extremism, but allowing a sort of literally a broad church.
Yeah. I mean, this is it. That term, I think, sums up what has been really the English genius since 1660, that terrible things happened in the 16th century and the 17th century, really over sort of quarrels, I think, essentially over religious extremism. And then setting up that kind of broad church system, which is, pretty much endured, I would say up until Second World War, perhaps, has been one of the crucial sort of causes of stability in this country. And I mean, like you, Christian, I found Brexit really quite troubling when people were starting to call each other Brexiteers and Remainers. That's exactly what happened before 1549 when people were calling each other papists and heretics. The same thing in the Civil War, Cavaliers and Roundheads. Once you get those partisan terms going into discourse and everybody using them, not just the sort of political nerds and enthusiasts, that's frightening.
I want to end on a positive.
Yes.
Mark, to say, so the book reminds people, let's do that bit first. Let's remind people what the book is called. I'm supposed to say where you can get it from. I think that's kind of obvious. Waterstones in Exeter was my go-to place, but yes, I'm sure it's available widely. It reminds people what it is called.
Yeah, so it's simply called now in the paperback version, it's simply The Western Rising of 1549. So we just boiled it down to a simpler title to kind of say exactly what it does on the tin. But yeah, it was published by Yale University Press, and you can get it in all the big bookshops and obviously all direct from Yale. But yes, please do buy and enjoy.
I have to say, there's a fascinating thing. When I was buying my copy, there were two slightly different shades of red on the paperback editions that were in front of me in the bookstore. And so I had to go talk to the staff and I said, is this the new enhanced edition? They said, no, they've just changed the colour slightly.
Yes,
which I thought was quite entertained me because you had two rival versions sitting on the table.
I must admit, I don't know why they did that because I got one of each and nobody told me there was going to be a slightly different shade of red. So I suspect it's probably got more to do with economics than aesthetics.
Right. No, it was a lovely image on the table of these two books talking about the same, but sort of just the divisiveness was on the table for all to see. But I'm delighted to tell you there was a big pile of them on the table, so they're readily. So if you are in Exeter, do pop into Waters's and pick one up, and if you're not, comes highly recommended. I think as people with detective Mark, you have a lovely way of making the story engaging and interesting, and that comes through in your writing. So the reason we're talking is I really want to recommend this book to people. But obviously, once they've devoured that, tell us what else you've published so they can then get their second and third helpings of you.
Oh, well, thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk about those. And yeah, I mean, the other things I've written are, I've written a book about witchcraft in the English Civil War. This was the story of Prince Rupert's dog that was believed to be a witch rather than a dog. And although that may sound a trivial story, I found that fascinating. There's so much to be said about witchcraft in the Civil War and the great witch hunt of 1645-7. I think that Prince Rupert's dog played its part in sort of clearing the way for that. So that's a book on, the Black Legend of Prince Rupert's dog. And the other big book I've done is really on the English Civil War, looking at what made people choose the sides they did and arguing that there is a very strong ethnic dimension to the English Civil War as well as a religious one. So that one's called Soldiers and Strangers. And again, it's about the kind of the forces that serve to tear societies apart. And I think in a way, all three of my books are doing the same, ethnic tension, religious tension, and sort of fear of, the supernatural and the occult. And all of those things have a very sort of destabilizing force about them, I think.
And you mentioned that this one had taken you 25 years to write.
Yes.
I presume there are other things. What can we expect next? Maybe in 25 years' time, Paul?
Well, no, I'm actually working on something which I hope will come a bit sooner than that, because by that time I hope to be retired. But I've been working with some colleagues on a book or a series of books really about the consequences of the civil wars. So the English Civil Wars of the 1640s, the worst conflict this country's ever been involved in. Casualty rates proportional were much higher than in the First and Second World War. So literally tens of thousands of ordinary men and women were left crippled or, shell-shocked or widowed by these events. And we're pulling together a huge collection of petitions, which were sent by very humble men and women, asking for financial aid to assist them in the aftermath of the war and telling their stories of what had happened to them during the Civil War. And we're bringing together thousands of these petitions into a set of 5 volumes that will tell the stories of literally thousands of very humble men and women who took part in the Civil War. So we're really excited to be bringing their voices to a big audience.
Fascinating. Love it. I want to say thank you for writing a great book that helped me produce a super relevant keynote on the day that I did my presentation. But it's a cracking read. I love the fact that there are people out there like you who have the ability, the time and the interest to go pursue this stuff, because I think we all benefit from it. And I'm looking back to my school days and just thinking, if only I might have paid more attention if there'd been this level of detail in there. But there wasn't, but we can all play catch up, and that's the key. That's the key bit about life. Every day is a school day. So thank you for writing an amazing book, Mark. But above all, thank you for being just a fabulous guest on the show. I've really enjoyed myself.
Oh, thanks, Christian. I mean, I feel just the same. And I really agree with you about, the importance of doing the history at school. I actually go out and give lots of talks in school myself. I always really enjoy it. And certainly, giving talks on the Western Rising down here in the West Country, it's just so thrilling to see that the younger generation of today are really interested in these stories and fascinated that they're growing up in the places where these things happened.
Love it. Thank you. So that's it for this episode of the show. My enormous thanks to Mark for appearing, and of course to you for listening. To find out more about Mark, his research, his books, including The Western Rising of 1549, and other things that we talked about in the show, have a look in the show notes. You'll find links to those there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk podcast, welcome. This was an unusual episode, but I think you might find some other ones that'll pique your interest. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. The show is available on all of the major podcasting platforms, and you can discover episodes of the show that you've missed at humanriskpodcast.com. I will be back very soon with another episode of the show, but in the meantime, stay safe. Thank you for indulging my fascination with an event from a long time ago that I think is really relevant. And of course, if you hire me, it's a good indication of the level of research that I'll go to make your event feel different. Stay safe, and remember, sometimes the past, no matter how far back, has some interesting lessons for today. I'll see you very soon on another episode of the Human Risk Podcast.